So chapter 9, A Husband for Penelope. As rosy dawn crept across the sky, Penelope was down in the storeroom, fetching Odysseus's great bow. She picked it up, with its long string hanging loose. She found a quiver full of arrows. Then she ordered Euryclea to bring up all the bronze and iron axes that Odysseus had won as trophies. By the time the suitors arrived, everything was ready for the contest. Telemachus had set up the axes in a line down the center of the hall, and Penelope was sitting by the hearth with the great bow in her hand. "This is how I shall choose my next husband," she announced. "I shall marry the man who can string this bow and use it to shoot an arrow through the loops of all these axes." "I must attempt it too," Telemachus said. "No one shall touch my father's bow before I have tried my strength and skill." He picked up the bow in both hands. 3 times he tried to bend it, but he couldn't quite loop the string into place. At his 4th attempt, he might have managed it, but Odysseus warned him off with a tiny shake of his head. That wouldn't fit their plan. As soon as Telemachus put down the bow, the suitors came crowding forward, each determined to pass the test and win Penelope. One by one, they picked up the bow and struggled to string it, but no one was strong enough. While they were struggling, Odysseus stepped outside the hall and went to find Eumaeus. "Faithful friend," he said, "it is time to tell you who I am." He parted his rags to show the long, silvery scar on his leg. When Eumaeus saw it, his face lit up, and he opened his mouth to shout for joy. "Stay quiet," hissed Odysseus. "First, we must drive out these wicked men. Go around the hall and lock all the other doors so that no one can escape." "It will be a pleasure," Eumaeus said fiercely. "And when I've done that, I'll come back to fight with you, and I'll bring the cowherd with me. You still have a few loyal servants around here." He set off at once, and Odysseus slipped back into the hall to watch the next man wrestling with his bow. So Odysseus's bow is really strong, and it's hard to bend to get the little string attached to the top of it. So they have to string it, and then they have to shoot the bow through the holes of all of these axes and then hit a target. Here's all of these different men struggling to string the bow. There were more than 100 of them, and the contest lasted all day. One suitor after another came forward, eager to take his turn. One by one they failed, abandoning their hopes and passing the bow on to the next man. Finally, as the sun began to set, the last suitor laid the bow aside, and a hush fell over the hall. Odysseus stepped forward. "Lady," he said to Penelope, "may I try the bow?" The suitors were outraged. They began to shout at him, but Penelope waved them aside. "Yes, you may try," she said. "If you succeed, I won't marry you, but you will have a rich reward." Telemachus pretended to be outraged too. "You'd let a beggar touch my father's bow? Go to bed, mother. This is a matter for men." Penelope bowed her head and laughed at him, and Odysseus picked up his bow. Ignoring the jeers of the suitors, he ran his hands over the wood. When he was sure it was sound, he bent the bow easily and slipped the string into its place. A silence fell over the hall. Odysseus plucked the bowstring, and it gave out a note as clear as a swallow's song. Then he took an arrow and set it on the string, taking aim at the axis. Moving so that all the rings were in a line, he drew the arrow back and paused for a second. Then he let it go. The arrow sped straight and true, flying through every one of the axe rings. It buried itself in the wall at the far end of the hall, and Odysseus turned to Telemachus. "I have not disgraced you, my son," he said. "Now let's give the suitors their supper and see them dance." "Yes, father," said Telemachus. With horror, the suitors realized who the beggar really was. Odysseus moved into the main doorway, and Telemachus sprang to his side, sword and spear in hand. Eumaeus and the cowherd stepped up behind them, and Odysseus took another arrow from his quiver. The suitors began to panic, especially when they discovered that all the other doors were locked. "We'll pay for every mouthful we've eaten," they've babbled. "We'll give you piles of gold and herds of oxen if you'll only let us go." "Gold and oxen can't pay for what you've done," Odysseus said fiercely. "What I want is justice. You've dishonored my house and almost ruined Ithaca with your greed. Stand up and fight." There were 100 suitors and only 4 men in the doorway, but the suitors knew Odysseus's reputation. Their hands trembled as they drew their swords, and then the battle began. So here's Odysseus and the cowherd and Telemachus and Eumaeus, these 4, and they are slaying all of these suitors who have been greedily eating all of the food and drinking all of the wine, just causing a ruckus for 20 years now, close to 20 years. Okay, so that's probably 164 and 165. It was a bloody and terrifying fight. Odysseus allowed a few of the men to escape with their lives, but the others had to pay for their crimes. By the time the battle was over, almost all the suitors were dead. Odysseus gave orders for the bodies to be removed. Then he had the hall cleaned and purified it with fire and sulfur. When everything was as it used to be, he sent Euryclea upstairs to announce that he was home. The nurse ran to Penelope's room and leaned over her bed. "Wake up," she said. "Your prayers have all been answered. Odysseus is here." Penelope lifted her head from the pillow. "Don't make fun of me," she said. "I'm serious," Euryclea insisted. "That old beggar was Odysseus in disguise, and now he's destroyed all your wicked suitors. Come and see." Penelope still didn't believe her. How could one man on his own defeat so many people? If the suitors have really been killed, it must have been done by one of the gods. Odysseus died long ago in some far-off foreign land. "What nonsense," Euryclea said. "Come downstairs and you'll see." "I'll come to see Telemachus," Penelope replied, "but I won't let a trickster take me in." She got out of bed and walked to the top of the stairs. Looking down, she saw the great hall, empty and clean at last, with a fresh wind blowing through it. And there in the middle of the hall was Telemachus, standing shoulder to shoulder with the ragged beggar. Could that really be Odysseus? Penelope was afraid to believe it. She had been fooled too many times before and heard too many lies. Ignoring the beggar completely, she went straight to Telemachus and hugged him. "What's the matter with you?" said Telemachus. "Can't you see my father here? You've waited so long. Why don't you greet him now?" Penelope looked sideways at the beggar. "If he really is my husband," she said, I shall know soon enough. Odysseus and I share many secrets that no one else knows." Telemachus shook his head impatiently, but Odysseus stayed calm. He had waited a long time already, but he was wise and patient. "Give your mother a chance to make up her mind," he said to Telemachus. "Let's bathe and put on clean clothes. Then we'll ask the musicians to come play some dancing music and see what happens." The two of them went away to wash off the blood from the fight. Then Odysseus dressed in his own royal clothes and went out into the hall. Penelope was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the music. Quietly, Odysseus sat down next to her. "What an odd woman you are," he murmured. "Here I am, back after 20 years, and you won't even speak to me. Any other woman would have thrown herself into her husband's arms." He raised his voice and called out to Euryclea, "Find me a bed of my own. I can't sleep with my wife. Her heart is as hard as iron." "What an odd man you are," Penelope replied. "I'm not hard-hearted, just careful. I've been faithful to Odysseus for 20 years, and I'm not going to let an impostor deceive me. You don't look like the man who sailed away 20 years ago." She turned around and nodded at Euryclea. "Do as our visitor asks. Move the great bed out of my husband's and my old bedroom, and make it up for him down here." As she gave the order, she was watching the man beside her. Only she and Odysseus knew the secret of that bed. If this stranger stayed silent now, he was certainly not her husband. But he didn't stay silent. As soon as she finished speaking, Odysseus jumped up, roaring with anger. "Woman, what have you done? I built that bed around an ancient olive tree. The first bedpost was made from the tree trunk, still rooted in the ground. Have you let someone cut through that trunk and move our bed?" Penelope started trembling with joy. She burst into tears and threw her arms around Odysseus. "It's you," she said. "Oh, Odysseus, it's really you. Don't be angry with me. No one has cut through the bedpost. But I've always been afraid that someone would come here and trick me by pretending to be you. So I thought up this plan to make sure I couldn't be deceived, because no one knows the secret of the bed except you and me." Odysseus hugged her hard, almost in tears himself. "How faithful and true you are," he said. "How wise and beautiful. I am a happy man to come home to such a wife." "Promise me that you'll never leave again," Penelope said. Odysseus hesitated. "What's the matter?" Penelope said quickly. Odysseus was remembering the prophecy of blind old Tiresias down in the land of the dead. "If you want to be free of Poseidon's curse, you must make another journey. Travel inland with an oar over your shoulder until you are far away from the sea. When someone mistakes your oar for a winnowing fan, sacrifice to Poseidon there. Then he will let you live in peace again." Slowly, he repeated the words to Penelope. Her heart sank at the thought of losing him again, but she didn't waver. "We can't live peacefully," she said, "while one of the gods is your enemy. If that is the price of a happy old age, then you must make that journey." Odysseus hugged her again, knowing that there would be a peaceful end to all his travels. Then he and Penelope walked up the stairs to their old room, beginning to tell each other the long story of all that had happened in the last 20 years. That's the end of this book. Okay. There's a page missing, though. It says, The missing page says The Mystery of Homer. This is a epilogue at the end of the book. The Mystery of Homer. The Odyssey is one of the greatest pieces of storytelling in the world, and one of the oldest. For almost 3,000 years, people have read about the adventures of Odysseus as he roamed the wide sea after the Trojan War, struggling to get home to the rocky island of Ithaca. But what about the storyteller? Who was Homer? That's one of the greatest mysteries of literature. According to ancient tradition, Homer was a blind poet. But maybe he was described like that simply because blind people were thought to have special insight and the power to foresee the future. Modern experts think he lived on the coast of Turkey in the 8th century BC, but the date and place aren't certain. And although we think his name was Homer, we can't be sure of that either. Perhaps there was no such person. What do we know? It seems clear that Homer, whoever he was, didn't invent these tales of men and God and monsters. They had been told for maybe 500 years before he lived. Before history could be written down, songs and stories were the best way of commemorating the great deeds of kings and heroes. The stories may have changed over hundreds of years of telling, but somewhere behind all the fantastic details of squabbling gods and terrifying monsters, there may well be a core of truth about things that actually happened. Poets sang or chanted these stories from memory, and because the songs were long and complicated, they used special tricks to help them remember. So, for example, they used set phrases and descriptions over and over again, talking about the wine dark sea or the wily Odysseus. Some of these set phrases have survived into the Odyssey, reminding us of its ancient oral roots. So if Homer didn't invent these stories, why is he famous? Why do we care who he was? The answer lies in the Odyssey itself. It's not just a collection of linked tales. The stories are wound together so skillfully that they become a single narrative. And there are 3 strands of suspense that run all the way through. Will Telemachus dodge the suitor's ambush and get back home safely? Will Penelope manage to fend off the suitors until her husband returns? Will Odysseus get back to Ithaca and be reunited with his wife? The Greeks of Homer's time were very different from us in many ways. Their attitude to religion seems strange to us, and so does the glorification of battles and fighting. But the way Homer presents Odysseus' adventures makes it easy to sympathize with him. He's a hero who still has a wide appeal today. When I told my friends I was working on a retelling of the Odyssey, the most unexpected people said, "I love the Odyssey. I've loved it all my life." And that's the real mystery, of course, that thousands of years ago, a man whose name we can't be sure of could sit down at a time we don't know exactly, in a place we can only guess, and write something that still moves and excites us today. Gillian Cross. She's the author who retold this book. That's the end. Hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did.